Okay, so we are good. So Itamar, before you start sharing the video, first of all, I want to welcome you to the Dialogue 2021. And before starting the journey, can you remind us your journey? When did you start the Palestinian Media Watch? What was the initial idea? How, the whole thing? Give us the why, the how, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Albert, for inviting me and for this wonderful event that you do. The Palestinian Media Watch, I founded it in 1996. It was 3 years after the signing of the Oslo Accords, and we felt it was critical to know what was happening in the internal Palestinian world. The messages they were giving to their people through their activities, through their culture, with particular focus on the messages they were giving to children, because we believe that children are the key to peace, and the messages that the PA gives to their children will determine if we have peace in the next generation. And more than that, even, it's also an indicator of what the Palestinian Authority really wants from this process. And to this end, we've been following everything we can from all the open sources. We study today all the Facebook pages and Twitter accounts of all the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. Every time they send out a message, we see what they're telling the people.
So it's not just the TV anymore. At some stage, you were just newspapers and TV, but now you've extended that to all social media.
Absolutely, to really every message. And what we're going to show today is a new report that we found, which I'll introduce separately when I start the presentation. But basically, we're getting the entire world view of the Palestinian Authority to its people through everything it controls, from schools, from school system, you name it. And it gives us a very, very clear message of what they really want from their people and what they want from their children.
Yeah, well, that's important that you explain about the sources. Now, how do you editing all of that? And because you obviously have a natural bias, which is from the Israeli viewpoint. So how do you edit and put it all together? I mean, is there, in the postmodern world we live in, construction is an easy thing to do. So how can you absolutely vouch that what you are showing is not in any way tampered with, and there is not a narrative that you're trying to construct, you're showing facts?
That's a great question, Albert, and it's an important question. First of all, we have 9 right now top Arabic language speakers. They have either gone through Israeli programs, some of them, 2 of them, born in Arab countries. So they're experts in Arabic. That's the first thing. The second thing is we go through everything, and I give instructions to every single researcher. They have to find everything that's related to peace, both negative messaging as well as positive messaging. And we report on the positive messaging, just like we report on the negative messaging. In our book that we published a few years ago, Deception, Betraying the Peace Process, we had a full chapter on positive messages that we found during the same period that we were writing the book. So that we're very, very important. The most important, I would say, proof of our objectivity in this is that the Palestinian Authority itself, which does not like Palestinian Media Watch, they're criticizing us regularly. In fact, Jibril Rajoub, who's one of the senior Palestinian Authority officials, went on TV and said that I was the Palestinian Media Watch is chasing after him, and that I was the Goebbels of the 21st century. That's what he said about me. Meantime, though, they have never, ever been able to point out something that was incorrect or a message that was incorrect. For example, when we reported on the Palestinian Authority paying salaries to terrorists, they were asked, are the PMW figures correct? And they answered, yes, the figures are correct. So the PA, the Palestinian Authority itself, I think, is the best corroboration that we are not filtering the messages. But I'll say something else. Every video that we show, We don't show with voiceover. We show with subtitles. Everyone who speaks Arabic can hear the words. Every item that we quote is sourced so people can look it up and check. It's all online, so that if anyone wanted to try to show that Palestinian Media Watch was not giving an accurate picture of the PA, it would be very easy for them to do it, but they have not done it because we really try to create an accurate picture as best as we can.
And your organization, has it got any connection to the Israeli government, or is it totally a private organization?
It's a completely private organization. Years ago, the first time that Netanyahu was prime minister in 1996 through 2000, because we were exposing this material, the government created, or the governments agreed to have a negotiating committee with the Palestinians and Americans called the Trilateral Anti-Incitement Committee. And Netanyahu appointed me then to be a negotiator for Israel. That was a connection that ended in 2000 when the Intifada started. And basically all negotiations ended at that point. But aside from that, we're completely independent, and we present our material. As you know, I've been in Australia many times and in other capitals around the world, and the material has led to major changes. I'll just point out one significant change is that members of parliament from Australia were in my office, I guess 3 years ago, and I made a full presentation to them, and I showed them, among other things, that the money that they were giving to the Palestinian Authority was going to pay terrorist prisoners in Israeli prisons. And the members of parliament were incensed. They went back to Australia. They spoke to members of government. The government immediately announced a freeze of all funding to the Palestinian Authority. And then a few months later, they said, well, we didn't get proper answers from the PA. We're cutting off all funding. And since then, the PA does not get any direct funding. So like I said, even that was another example of the Australian government verified with the PA first that our figures were correct, and then they acted and they cut off all funding. Today, UNRWA receives money from Australia, but the PA government does not receive money from the Australia.
How many people work for your organization now, directly and indirectly?
So today we have about 17 people who are working for PMW.
So that's a lot of mouths to feed. How do you get by?
We get by with contributions from independent sources, from foundations in the United States, Canada, Europe, as well as Australia.
So you fundraise. You simply fundraise.
Absolutely, and that way we can keep our independence. Yes.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think it's important to give all those facts for people hearing this, looking at this. I mean, it's not like you making yourself a billionaire by running this enterprise. You've devoted your life to a cause, basically. And may I also ask you, have you thought of extending what you're doing to other areas like Hezbollah, like the Syrians, like other places, Iran? What's going on there? What is the message that they give to their population about Israel?
I think that's critical. I think what's important, though, the Palestinian Authority is the organization that creates the messages that will decide if we have peace with our Palestinian neighbors. And that's why we want to focus specifically on the Palestinian Authority. I want to even go one step further. In recent years, we have been working with Palestinians who sincerely want peace, Palestinians who grew up on these hate messages. There's one Palestinian who's already met with me, together with members of foreign parliaments who've been in Israel. And he tells his story. He tells, first I make my presentation and he says, yes, I was brought up on this hatred. I believed Israelis were these monsters. And then he explains how he learned that he was brought up on these lies and how he is now a peace activist trying to fight for real peace between Israel and Palestinians, which means stopping the hate messaging coming from the Palestinian leadership. So there are many Palestinians who are disgusted with the hate messages from their leadership.
And you cannot give his name, because if you did, he would be a dead man, right?
Absolutely. In fact, in one of my lectures that I gave overseas, he sent a video, but we had to completely, this was also in a parliament overseas, he had his face completely hidden because, in fact, I'll just add to what you're saying. One of the members of parliament asked him, how many Palestinians share your views? And he says, I don't know. People are afraid to talk. He said, well, what do you mean? How many people know your opinions? And then he counted. He said, maybe 6 or 7. I'm afraid to tell other people my opinions because I'll end up in a Palestinian Authority police station being tortured. So that's a Palestinian speaking to members of parliament.
So let me ask you a last question, and then I'll let you do your presentation. From all of what you know, from all of those databases that you have, and so on, do you see any particular trend that could make us hope for peace in the near future, or do you see it going the other way? How do you see it?
I think if the Palestinian Authority is weakened enough, and they're weakened because of countries like Australia that refuse to fund them, then they, with their back against the wall, they might start sincerely promoting peace. I'll just point out that Yasser Arafat, when he signed the Oslo Accords, he did it when he was at his weakest point internationally, weakest point amongst Palestinians, and weakest point amongst the Arab world, because he had supported Iraq in its war against the Gulf states, against Kuwait. So he was very weak, and it was the weakness that made him start a process. In retrospect, it wasn't an honest process. What we would hope is that if the Palestinian Authority today becomes weak enough and realizes that they cannot move ahead forward without Israel, without the international community, they will have to make a decision. Okay, let us change, fundamentally change, and I think that would be the key to peace.
But there's a fundamental difference. Yasser Arafat had the credential with the Palestinian people there that no one has today. So today there's no elected, I mean, the elected representative have been elected now for 17 years. You know, it's a mandate that was supposed to last for 3 years. It's now 17 years. So no one really has the charisma and credibility among the Palestinians than Yasser Arafat had. So that in itself would be a difficulty, I guess. But I was asking about the trend in your data. Based on your data, so leaving aside your or my opinion, do you think that the noise coming out of the data is more problematic today than it used to be, or is there a trend that you can define?
The messages today, I would say, are worse than they've ever been, and that's what you're going to see in the presentation. The presentation is about a new report on an educational program that hasn't been exposed until today, and then comparisons throughout to what the messages the PA leadership is giving today. And you will see in so many respects, we're at the worst period of Palestinian messaging right now.
Okay, so Itamar, thank you, and I'll let you start your presentation.
Okay. Again, thank you very much, Albert. So today's presentation has been named The Brainwashing of a Generation. And what we're going to be looking at is a new report prepared by Palestinian Media Watch. It's a study of a Fatah magazine named Wa'ad. Now, Fatah has a youth group, which it calls Lion Cubs and Flowers. Lion Clubs are the boys, Flowers are the girls. It's for ages 6 to 15. So we're talking about very young children. Now, this Fatah youth group also produces a magazine which is called Wa'ad, which means the promise. So it's, again, looking to the future. Now, what's so important about this magazine is it hasn't been known until we discovered this a few months ago. And we then went back and studied 6 years of Palestinian Authority messaging through this magazine, every single issue for 6 years, to see what have they been teaching their children under the radar of foreign criticism. The school books, we first reported on their problems already in 1999. So the school books have been modified because of pressure, and even the TV has a little bit been modified. But this has not been touched. And so in many respects, we're getting a pristine message of Fatah, which of course Mahmoud Abbas's party. What is the messages that they're giving to the children going back 6 years? And tragically, this is the antithesis of peace education. Literally, the antithesis. When you'll see this material, it's Fatah 1965 ideology. It's not post-Oslo Accords ideology. It's Fatah 1965, and that's what I want to show you today. And I'm going to start with the fundamental message, and then I'm going to explain why it's a systematic ideology. The fundamental message of the PA is that Palestine is destined to replace Israel from the river to the sea. And I want to show this to you in a few examples before we even get into the ideology, how they defend this message. Palestine will replace Israel from the river to the sea. Now, this is an activity, November 28th. Most of the things you're going to see are literally within the last weeks and months, aside that are connected to the report. This is an activity of that Fatah Lions and Clubs, Lion Cubs and Flowers movement. They had this activity, like I said, just a couple of weeks ago, November 28th. And they put on their website, what was the goal of the activity? The goal is to emphasize the firm truth that is not negotiable, and it is that Palestine is Arab from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the sea. Its capital is Jerusalem, and that it will be liberated sooner or later. This is the message that came out just now from the same organization that produces Wa'ad. Now, a week before, on November 18th, they posted also on their Facebook page. This is the Facebook page that produces Wa'ad. I want to show you a little girl. What is her message that they felt was important to post on their Facebook page?
We're going to free Palestine, and finally comes our time. We're going to free our land, together and hand in hand. Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
This is again the same message coming from the same youth organization of Fatah, all of this within the last couple of weeks. And I want to show you also within the last month, this is the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Education. They had a big event, and they had events all through the school system in November. And these were the messages, and they actually posted this on the Ministry of Education Ministry of Education Facebook page. Now, what is it? You see the map here that includes all of Israel and the Palestinian territories, and the text over here in the Arabic, Palestine. The entire land is ours from the river to the sea. Ministry of Education of the Palestinian Authority. What about peace with Israel? There is no Israel. And they also posted this the same day, my homeland, again with a Palestinian Authority flag. So these are the messages that are coming. And this is the fundamental message, that Palestine from the river to the sea is theirs and will be theirs. Now, what I want to show you now is go into the specifics. I want to break up this message into a systematic Palestinian Authority Fatah ideology to understand how they package this goal of destroying Israel as a message of justice, because they don't come and say, we're going to be evil, we're going to destroy them, we're going to kick out the Jews. No, they package this all as justice. And I want to show you there are 5 components to this ideology, and then I will show you the examples both from the Fatah Wa'ad magazine as well as from recent examples from the Palestinian Authority to show you that Fatah and the PA are really one and the same. In any case, these are the messages. 1, Palestinians have a 5,000-year-old history in the land. 2, the Jews have no history in the land. Therefore, Israel has no right to exist. The Palestinians have all the rights, including the right to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea, all in the name of justice. Now, the next stage is that since Israelis are not leaving on their own, fighting and killing Israelis is a Palestinian right. And again, rights here are important. They have a right to liberate. They have a right to fight. These are messages that keep coming up in the children's education. And not only adults, even children have the obligation, the right to fight. And you'll see this in their magazine. Finally, Israel's destruction is guaranteed. This is a historical imperative that eventually all invaders, all colonialists disappear, and that's their message to their people. And now I want to break this down into its components and show you how this systematic ideology is being transmitted to Palestinian children. First of all, Palestinians are a 5,000-year-old people. I'm going to show you some examples from Wa'ad magazine. This is the magazine we're studying now. Palestinians showed interest in raising bees 10,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, Palestinian residents settled in. For thousands of years, the Palestinian farmers have used it. Palestinians have been living for thousands of years. So the first message is they have an ancient Palestinian people. That's the first message. Now, there is no historical record because there was no Palestinian people back then, but in order to create legitimacy for their children and make them think that they have a real history, what do? They connect themselves to actual historical nations and actual historical people. So for example, they define the ancient Canaanites as follows: the Canaanite Palestinian Arab people. They define the Jebusites. Jebusites were a Canaanite Arab tribe 4,000 years ago. They talk about the Canaanite Arabs in the 4th millennium, BCE. And they talk about Jesus being a Palestinian. The prophet Jesus was born in the Canaanite Palestinian city of Bethlehem. Now, of course, this is again just a little bit of a reminder. The name Palestine was given by the Roman Empire to the area of Judea after the revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the year 135. They changed the name to Palestina because they wanted to. They thought they had destroyed Judea once and for all, and they wanted to change the name, and they gave it the name Palestina. So at this whole period we're talking about, there was no such possibility of a Palestinian. It was called the land of Israel, and it was called Judea. It was not called Palestinian, Canaanite, Palestinian Arab people. So this is, first of all, complete myth. Now, together with the creation of the Palestinian people, and first I just want to say one thing. Some people say, okay, let the Palestinians create a 5,000 people a year-old nation. Why does it matter to Israel? And the answer is, if it was just an internal message of identity creation, that would be fine. But what we see in this report is they use this message of a 5,000-year-old people as justification for the ultimate destruction of Israel. They build all of their rights based on this ancient people. And therefore, it's not just internal nation building ideology. It's a justification for constant war with Israel. And that's what I'm going to show you, why this is so dangerous. Now, in addition, they take away Israel's rights in the identical fashion by saying there never was an Israeli people. And I'll give you one of the examples, which is a very strong one, but there are many examples in the messaging. This is the Palestinians, or the Fatah magazine was explaining to its children why the Palestinians and why the Arabs at the time rejected the UN resolution to partition Palestine. And this is what they wrote to the children. The Palestinian people rejected the 1947 UN partition resolution that gives rights to our land and our homeland. Now, this is how they defined Jews and Israelis: to foreigners who came from all ends of the earth, foreigners who did not know Palestine, who did not live in it, neither them nor their fathers and their forefathers. They do not even have one color or one ethnic origin. They are a strange and odd mixture of different races. So Israelis, fathers and forefathers, and again, this is not just slurring Jewish history. This is erasing Israel's right to exist. That's how the PA packages it. You see, they had no rights to our land because they were never here. So the child grows up feeling we are an ancient nation and we don't have Jaffa, we don't have Haifa, we don't have Akko, we don't have the Israeli cities. And those people, they don't have any history here because nobody was here. Therefore, we have the rights and they have no rights. That's the message from the people. Now, I want to show you, and with everything, this is the Fatah magazine. Now, this is Palestinian television. The same messages, the PA and Fatah, it's one and the same. This is Palestinian TV a few months ago after Israel was making more archaeological finds in Jerusalem.
بهدف تعريف السياح على رواياتهم المزعوم.
هذه صور من حفريات إسرائيلية التي لم يثبت فيها أي وجود أثري لمعبدهم المزعوم. هذا الفيديو الدعائي يهدف إلى استقطاب السياح وتلقينهم الرواية الإسرائيلية التي لا أساس لها على الواقع.
It has no basis. It's only in their heads that are full of legends and fantasies. This is the message Israel. So we're getting it. The children are getting it, and we're getting the adult message on Palestinian TV, and it's many times there never was a Jewish connection. That is their message. Now, this is just a month ago on Palestinian TV. again, children responding with the same ideology they're being taught. And this is so important. We see the input from the Palestinian education, but then we see the output when children use the same messages. Look at this girl on Palestinian TV talking about how those foreigners, those impure people came and are taking her land.
وأتوا ليقولوا عن وطني أنه وطنهم وبلادي تاريخي سكني أصبحت بلدهم القدس هل يعقل يا ناس تصبح ملك المحتلين هل هي عاصمة الأنجاس.
No, is it the capital of the impure? The Jews are being defined here as impure. It's my homeland. They're taking it. So what we're seeing is the input in the education, and then a child who's asked to say something on TV, she responds with this kind of a message. Now, so Palestinians have a 5,000-year history. Jewish history is erased. However, what about the authentic Jewish history? So this is rewritten as Palestinian history. And I'll just give you one example of something that appears many times. Palestine underwent dozens of invasions. Babylonians, the Persians, the Samaritans, the Assyrians, the Hyksos, the Hittites, the Pharaohs, and the Hebrews, later the Greeks and the Romans, until liberation in the 6th century CE. This is the Omer. And eventually the European Crusaders invaded it again until it was liberated by Saladin. But what was the critical thing here? All of these, the Babylonians, Persians, Assyrians, Greeks and Romans, they all invaded Judea or Samaria. They all and here it is being presented as if they were Palestine was there. There was a Palestinian people that was invaded. So literally, so they erase Israeli history and turn it into Palestinian history. Again, this is what gives them all of the rights. Now, sometimes they do this in an absurd way, and this one is almost humorous, but it has to be seen. This is a recent issue. They put a picture here of an ancient coin that was found actually during the Persian period. Now, it says here in ancient Hebrew, Yud He Daled Yahud, which means Judea. So they put here a Judean coin, and this is what they write to the children. The shekel, which is, of course, the Israeli currency today and was the ancient Israeli currency. The shekel, is it Canaanite or Israeli? The shekel is a Palestinian currency and not an Israeli currency. Pay attention to the picture of the ancient Canaanite shekel. The same picture appears on the new shekel. The new Israeli shekel has this flower over here. And then they write thieves, aren't they? So Israel is a thief for using an ancient coin, which was an ancient Judean coin, but we're thieves because they're saying this is Palestinian currency. Again, it's part of the demonization of Israel, delegitimization of Israel. All the rights come over to them. Now, like I said, this fictitious history gives them the right to replace Israel. And I'll give you one example of this. This is justice. This was one of the times on Nakba Day. This is the day, the anniversary of the creation of the state of Israel. And they write as follows. This Nakba Day was to talk about the injustice that was inflicted on our people and its absolute right to take back its rights in full and its certain return to its homeland. So this is the key. They have the absolute right to take back the rights in full. This means destruction of Israel. They are defining the rights based on this fictitious history as the right to destroy Israel. This is coming again in the Wad magazine of Fatah. Now, they also teach regularly to children to see a world without Israel. Even today, Israel doesn't appear on even one map in the entire magazine, as it doesn't appear in the school book maps. It doesn't appear on TV maps. They also have quotes like this: "There is no Israel, there is only Palestine." This is from Wad magazine. And then they have even the following crossword puzzles. So here you have a crossword puzzle, and the clue is an occupied Palestinian city. The answer is Safed. Now, the Safed is not in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. It's not near Jerusalem. It's in the northern Israel, and it's called an occupied Palestinian city. And the same here, a city in Palestine that was occupied in 1948. Ramla is a city near Tel Aviv. So even through crossword puzzles and games, they're teaching these messages that all of Israel is Palestine. Now, I want to show you an incredible film that Palestinian television brought on a children's program this year. And you see the children are being given the identical messages here. This is Palestinian TV this year.
السهل الساحلي الفلسطيني هو وجه فلسطين نحو البحر المتوسط والعالم العربي، ونقطة احتكاك حضاري بين الشرق والغرب، ويمثل بوابة فلسطين للعالم. يمتد الساحل الفلسطيني من جبل الكرمل شمالاً إلى رفح على الحدود المصرية جنوباً، ويقع بين المرتفعات الجبلية الفلسطينية شرقاً والبحر الأبيض المتوسط غرباً. فيه العديد من الموانئ مثل ميناء حيفا وعكا ويافا وأسدود وعسقلان وغزة، وقد توافدت عليه مختلفة عبر العصور طمعاً للاستفادة من موقعه، وما زال الساحل الفلسطيني
Okay, the Palestinian coastal plain has been under Israeli occupation since 1948. Why is this so important? When Palestinians meet with officials from Canberra, from Australia, from officials around the world, they say we're against the Israeli occupation to their own people. And they say that they're talking about the 1967 Six-Day War, but to their own people, the occupation started in 1948. This is the clear message on Palestinian TV, as you see here, and it is the repeated message over and over again in the WAD magazine of Fatah to children. Everything in Israel is an occupation. And notice in this presentation here on TV, they mentioned Haifa, Akko, Jaffa, Ashdod, Ashkelon. These are all part of Israel. And they're presenting them as all under Israeli occupation since 1948. Now, therefore, as I've said, it's the Palestinian Authority right and goal to destroy Israel. And this will be justice. This is critical. This is packaged as justice, historical justice. And I want to again show this to you in their own words, a few examples of this, because this message is so important. They have a right to fight. They have a right to what they use armed conflict. Armed conflict or armed struggle for them includes fighting and killing Israeli civilians, as you will see in the examples that I will show you. So here they had something to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of Fatah. And they say as follows, this is what they teach. They have the right to wage an armed struggle to take back its stolen homeland. Again, the key word here is right. And they talked about how they started and in the beginning of the armed struggle to liberate Palestine. There's no hinting here. There's no hint of Israel's legitimacy and right to exist. There's no talk here about liberating West Bank and Gaza Strip. It's all about liberating all of Israel. And many examples, I'll give a few of them. Fatah is an armed revolutionary movement whose goal is, now it doesn't say whose goal was, it's whose goal is liberating Palestine from the thieving Zionist entity. By the way, throughout the magazine, it rarely mentions the word Israel. This is how it refers to Israel. Expressions like thieving Zionist entity, and even worse. And restoring the right to its Palestinian owners who own the right. Again, it's all about rights, Palestinian rights. You'll hear Palestinians say, we just want our rights. Well, they are defining the rights as destruction of Israel. They're waging armed forces to liberate Palestine that was stolen, etc. So this is the message. And again, I'm showing you a few examples. We're not picking and choosing. This is the message of Fatah to its children. They even bring the PLO logo here and they explain it. And they teach them that the following, the flames over here above the Palestinian flag, it means that the liberation of Palestine will be only achieved through armed struggle. Armed struggle, again, that's the euphemism for terror. At the bottom is the map of Palestine. So this is Palestine that will be achieved through armed struggle, through terror. Now, I want to jump to the PA again to show you how the Palestinian Authority is that is Fatah in this magazine is justifying terror because it's their right to liberate Palestine. I'm going to show you another justification. This was horrific. This is Mahmoud Abbas's personal advisor on Islam. He goes on television and he tells Palestinians about the obligation in the Quran to kill those people who are violating certain rights. He lists 10 things. The 10 things he lists are all things that Palestinians say Israel is violating, and he's telling them the Quran obligates them. This is Abbas's advisor on Islam. He's head of the Sharia courts, the Islamic courts. Listen to how he defends and even obligates fighting and killing Israelis wherever you find them.
إذن اقتلوهم عائدة على المعتدين ولا تعتدوا إن الله لا يحب المعتدين واقتلوهم. المعتدين اقتلوهم، لأنه لو أجا واحد يعتدي علي، يعتدي على بيتي، يعتدي على أرضي، يعتدي على وطني، يعتدي على مالي، يعتدي على عرضي، يعتدي على أهلي، أنا مأمور إني أقاتله، مأمور إني أواجهه، مأمور إني أقاومه، ومسموح لي إذا لزم الأمر أن أقتله، كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، وكما قالت هذه الآية: واقتلوهم.
Kill them wherever you find them. That's what he's quoting from the Quran. He gives all these reasons why you have an obligation to fight and kill. If someone attacks your land, your homeland, your property, your honor, these are all things the PA is telling the people Israel is doing. And then he says you have an Islamic obligation to kill. So here he's sort of telling people, don't worry about killing an Israeli civilian, because the Quran is obligating it. This is what Muhammad wants of you. And that's the tragedy here of this education. They're mixing this invented nationalism of 5,000-year-old people. And then here you've got adding in this Islamic component that, yes, this is what Allah wants of you. So it's a very dangerous, and this is the PA and Fatah all giving the same messages, the same justifications. Now, young people aren't watching sermons like the one we just saw from the top religious figure in the PA. But they are listening to music. We hear hundreds of songs during the year promoting violence. I want to play one because it was on TV 20 times this year. 20 times the Palestinian Authority broadcast this song on TV this year.
نحمي فلسطين بصدورنا يزغرد رصاصنا لنا.
Okay, our bullets will make sounds of joy to herald victory, detonating explosive belts 20 times this year on Palestinian TV, this song alone. Now, I want to go down to even younger children who are doing music. This is a month ago on Palestinian TV, a young girl talking about violence against the world's dogs. Jews here are the world's dogs.
يا فلسطين راح ترجعي يا ابو صلاح الدين، بس لو تدرين للنصر الجاي للناصر حطين. يهودي قناص القدس طاغى والجبار، لم كلاب العالم فيكي وبأرضك عسكر، مقاوم سلاح الحجر وعمره ما بتخسر.
Okay, resistance is a weapon in Iraq. The Jew defiled Jerusalem and gathered the world's dogs. The world's dogs is the world's Jews. This is on Palestinian TV a month ago. The same hate messages and the violence here, of course, is being promoted. We're going to take stones, etc., etc. Now, so you have the promotion of violence, but then after the fact, you have to actually glorify the violence. And I want to show you a horrific example that appears in the Wad magazine. This is in the magazine for young children by Fatah. The picture you see here is a young Israeli woman, 26-year-old Dalia Lemkus, who was murdered in a terror attack a few years ago. Now, how was she murdered? A terrorist came to where she was she was hitchhiking. Terrorists drove into the hitchhike, knocked her over, and she fell to the ground. She hadn't been killed by the car. He got out of his car, and while she was lying helpless on the ground, he went and he stabbed her repeatedly until she was killed. Now, this particular case, aside from all terror, which is horrific, this also had a personal connection to me because my wife is head of an occupational therapy program, and Dalia was a student of hers in this program, murdered by a Palestinian terrorist. Now, how is this murder presented in Wad magazine? How is this gruesome, ruthless murderer described in Wad magazine? And this is what I want you to see. This is the quote from the magazine. It goes as follows. The Palestinian prisoner is one of the heroic fighters of Palestine. The best example is prisoner Maher Hashlamun. Now, this is the one who killed her. He's the best example of a heroic prisoner. Why? He had the most beautiful smile and carried out a heroic car ramming operation. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences, and despite this, when his sentence was read, he gave the smile with which he angered the occupier and drove him crazy. So running over Dalia and then stabbing her is presented to children as a heroic car ramming operation. Why? Because as I said to you, they have justified the killing of Israeli civilians because they say we have no right to exist in the land. Now, Palestinian Authority directs their violence and martyrdom even to children. And I want to show you 3 examples that all appeared at a very, very significant point. In 2015, 2016, and I told you we've gone back to 2015 in reviewing this, all their magazines. So during that period, there was what the Palestinians called the Knife Intifada. Now, in the end, about 40 Israelis were murdered during the Knife Intifada, and many, many Palestinian teenagers were participants in this terror. Many Palestinian youth were involved in the terror. It was knives and a lot of car rammings. Now, I want to show you the magazine that was released during the Knife Intifada. These are the messages to the children. So while there's a terror war going on and while children are involved, this is what they teach the children. It's important to note the children's role in the Palestinian activity in the period of armed struggle, the RPG's children, the children of the rocks. And to this very day, the children constitute a vanguard in the struggle to defend Al-Aqsa Mosque, as is clearly known in the Al-Aqsa Uprising. The Al-Aqsa Uprising is another word for the Knife Intifada. So here they're saying the children are the vanguard even today. Instead of saying stay home, stay out of trouble, be careful, no, they're promoting children participating, teenagers participating in the vanguard of this terror wave. And then what they did, that was on page 11. 4 pages later in the magazine, they actually show and honor a 16-year-old girl who went on a terror attack, stabbed an Israeli woman an Israeli policewoman before she was shot and killed. So this is the girl, the student. They put this on her place in school, and in the magazine, they write, Bayan's seat is empty, but her spirit remains. Not a word of criticism about going out on a terror attack, nothing. They're honoring her here. And then a few pages later, 2 pages later, what do they write to these young children, ages 6 to 15? Palestine is my entire life. Life and the children are a sacrifice for your sake, oh my precious. This is child abuse, literally. While there's a war with teenagers going on, a terror wave, and they're encouraging children to sacrifice their lives for Palestine. Life and the children are a sacrifice for your sake. This is Fatah's magazine during a terror war. Now, I'm going to go back to the PA for 1 second, because this is we thought we've seen it all, and then we see something like this, and it's just not imaginable. At the end of the terror wave, in June, after the terror wave had ended in June 2016, it was a day of matriculation exams. Now, during the period of the terror, 16 Palestinian teenagers had attacked Israelis and were killed in their terror attacks. Aside from the many that were arrested, 16 were killed. So how does Wafa, the official Palestinian news agency and the official newspaper, how do they respond to these 16 children on graduation day? They would have graduated, but they're not graduating. So instead of telling the Palestinian population, oh, we mourn their death, it's a shame they went out and killed themselves. No, look at what they write. The day of the publication of the high school matriculation exams is a day of long expectations. The families of the martyrs and their relatives find themselves proud of the martyrdom that their children achieved with the Creator. 16 students succeeded. For death as a martyr is the path to excellence and greatness, and the path to those who know how to reach the great victory. So this is shocking to anyone who cares about children, to anyone who cares about children not being competent, to anyone who cares about children having a good life, being brought up to have a good life. The Palestinian Authority told the families of those 16 children that they're the ones who succeeded, not all the hundreds or thousands of Palestinian children who had matriculation and succeeded and are graduating high school. No, the ones who really succeeded are the martyrs, the ones who attacked Israelis and were killed, because the path, death as a martyr is the path to excellence and greatness. And they have achieved the great victory. So this is tragic. It's tragic, but this is the world, as you see, of the Palestinian child that the Palestinian leadership is directing, and we see it coming. We see this coming from Fatah, from the mainstream, and from the Palestinian Authority. Now, I want to show you how this is continuing. A few seconds of a video on TV just a few months ago. In the name of freedom, we'll sacrifice our lives. Why are these 2 6 or 7-year-olds saying this on Palestinian TV? But it's a constant messaging of the Palestinian leadership. And when these children grow up to be 16 and 17, and there's a terror wave going on. Who knows? Who knows what they're going to do? Because they've been taught to sing that in the name of freedom, they're going to sacrifice their lives. Now, the final message here that comes across is not just that the history demands that Israel be fought, but they also teach that Israel's destruction is inevitable. It's part of a historical process. All colonialists and all invaders have left. And I want to show you a number of examples because this is important to see how the PA is presenting this. This is from Wad magazine again, from the magazine we're reporting on. Over thousands of years, the Palestinians have fought against all the invaders, it says. And then they go as follows. There is no invader who invaded the land and did not leave it defeated in the end. And that's what will happen to the Zionist invaders. Leave it defeated in the end. This is another example from the Wad magazine. Palestine fell under Zionist occupation, which continues to this very day. The occupation will cease to exist just as what was before it ceased to exist. As we said, Palestine underwent many invasions. All the invaders were defeated. Palestine returned to be free and Arab. Another example, the Battle of the Crusaders marked the end of the Crusader invaders after approximately 200 years. This teaches us that the period of Zionism will eventually pass sooner or later, as Palestine is the property of the Palestinians. The messages are repeating. It's a brainwashing, an indoctrination. It's over and over again. As you see, it comes in crossword puzzles, it comes in texts, it comes in videos. It's coming everywhere for these Palestinian children. Now, what about the Jews? The Jews who are here. There are 8 million Jews living in Israel today. What's going to happen to them? So this is the message that the Palestinian Wad magazine teaches their children. They talk about Israel being a colonial invader, and then they teach as follows. Algeria received independence in 1962 after 132 years of colonialism. What happened to the French? They all fled to France and left Algeria to the Arabs and Algerians. And then Algeria's experience assures that the Jewish settlers in Palestine will disappear in the end. And by the way, you see here, they actually printed this in red and in a larger font to highlight this to the children. The Jews are gone. And again, the settlers are not people in the West Bank. The settlers are people in Tel Aviv and Haifa. This is what the magazine calls settlers. And it proves all the Jews are going to leave. This is the message the children are growing up in. And this will be the justice. This will be the justice that Palestinian children have to expect. They have children's writings in this magazine as well. And this one was handwritten by a child. Here's the handwriting of the child. And what does she write? We see again, this is output. The children are learning what the leadership is teaching them. Palestine is the most beautiful and best place in the world. But when it will be liberated from the Jews, it will be much more beautiful. This is, again, in the Wad magazine. So we have the children in Wad magazine. I want to show you in 2021. And that's why this is so important. In 2021, the Palestinian Authority is giving the identical message that was appearing for the children. They're giving it to adults, that Israel's demise is inevitable. And I will show you these final examples. This is on TV in March of this year. Since the establishment of the occupation state in 1948, until now, the excavations are continuing. If they have something that testifies they were in this land, let me see it. They are transient and will remain transient. They will not continue in this land. There is nothing that testifies to they were ever here. Again, this is important. It connects the history that they're rejecting to the fact that Israelis have to leave. Since we have no history, we have to leave. This is also from the official Palestinian newspaper just a few months ago. The fate of the present invaders will be no better. When they leave, again, the message Jews are going to leave, we will preserve for them one line written in blood in our land's history. This is the official paper of Mahmoud Abbas. They talk about the bloodthirsty, brutal, and barbaric enormous armies that came to Palestine throughout history. The British left, and the Israelis, who are also thieves, will surely leave defeated, and it goes on and on. And this is also from Palestinian TV recently. I won't play it, I'll just read it. History has never let the colonialists remain, and the occupiers have always left. One day, they, the Jews, will return to where they came from. So we see this message is coming, and everything I'm showing you is current, all of this within the last few months. So let me then summarize and close with a review here. Palestinians teach their people in Wad and through the Fatah through Wad and the Palestinian Authority through its messaging. Palestinians have a 5,000-year history in the land. and therefore they have all the rights. The Jews have no history in the land, and therefore we have no rights. And therefore, since Israel has no rights, Palestinians have the right, and in the name of justice, they can liberate, and they will liberate Palestine. And since Israelis aren't going on their own, Palestinians have the right to fight and kill Israelis, literally under international law. They say they have this right to fight and kill Israelis. And because history is part of a process and it repeats itself, colonial powers invade and eventually leave, even after hundreds of years. They talk about that. The Crusaders left after hundreds of years, so too Israel's destruction is guaranteed, and eventually Israel will leave. This is the message of the Palestinian Authority. And I'll just end with the item that I started with, this Fatah Lions, Cubs, and Flowers magazine, WAD. So they had an event just a couple of weeks ago, and they write as follows: the firm truth that is not negotiable, Palestine is Arab from the river to the sea, and it will be liberated sooner or later. And that comes together with this map in the WAD magazine. This is a tragic message. Alberio asked in the beginning, has the message gotten any better? And as you see, all of this material from the last few months, all of it from 2021, it is literally worse than it ever was before. In the past, the Palestinian Authority would use euphemisms to describe Israel's destruction because they knew that the international community would respond. Today, and I sort of blame the international community here, the international community, except for countries like Australia, who've taken a principled stand, most of the international community continues to give them political support and somewhat financial support in spite of all this hatred. How can you give money to the Palestinian Authority, which supports Fatah, when they're telling their children that that the Jews are the dogs, that the Jews are the invaders, that every one of them is going to leave, and Israel's destined to be destroyed? And because the international community has not taken a stand against this, except with lip service occasionally, they continue. And the more they continue, the more their people are going to suffer, and the more Israelis are going to suffer. And this is my call here. This is a very important conference, and we're talking to international leaders here. You have an obligation to take a stand against this in the Palestinian Authority. You've criticized from your parliaments, from your governments, what they call Palestinian incitement. It is not just incitement. This is an ideology. It's a worldview. This must change. If there's ever going to be peace, children have to be brought up to see Israel as a neighbor and not as an invader who is destined to disappear. And I think it's in the hands of the international community. You can have much more influence than Israel. Thank you for taking a stand.
Thank you, Itamar. Itamar, first of all, a comment about your presentation. So the kids and their recitations is awful, because you mentioned that one of the little girls was spontaneous, but I don't think that was, I don't think you used the word spontaneous, but you implied that it was. It seems very, very rehearsed. I mean, a little child like this reciting this sort of poetry in inverted commas that has been the subject of many, many hours, days, weeks of teaching. So there's therefore the message that you are sending here is that they are teaching this. The question is whether that is done by parents that are zealots, or whether it's done by the school systems, by the education. But the fact that they are showing it on TV, it's quite bad. The other comments that I want to make is regarding Hamas. All of what you've shown here seems to come from the Palestinian Authority, but the conflict this year, in any case, came from the south, came from the Gaza Strip. So if I may ask you to comment on this as well.
Okay, so we have to, even understanding that conflict is very important. The Hamas joined the conflict only after the Palestinian Authority had already started a conflict. The Palestinian Authority, and let's get the history of this year, because it's so important to understand what happened this year. The Palestinian Authority, after 16, 17 years, finally announced they would have democratic elections. The elections were scheduled for May 23rd. On April 30th, the last day that he had the opportunity to do this, Mahmoud Abbas canceled the elections. And he did this because he was guaranteed that Fatah was going to lose. Hamas was going to win both in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We would have had a Hamas legislature and a Hamas prime minister, Hamas ruling in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So Mahmoud Abbas decided he would cancel the elections. Now, in order to, and Palestinians were furious. Across the board, Palestinians were furious. They wanted to have a democratic elections. Hamas was also furious. Because of this, Abbas started violence in connection to Sheikh Jarrah. Now, why do I say he started violence and connected to Sheikh Jarrah? Is an area talking about, I think, 4 Palestinian families who are living in homes that are owned by Israel, and they've been refusing for many years to pay rent. Now, there have been hundreds of cases over the years of Palestinians being removed from homes that belong to Israelis or belong, and there was never any violence, minor violence. But Abbas now, because he needed a conflict because he was so demonized by his people, because he had canceled elections, he turned this into a conflict. The people were telling us they were outsiders who were coming to the neighborhood. Many, many more people were coming to start the violence. They started violence in the area around Jerusalem. I would even go farther. I mentioned to you that I showed you one video that was on 20 times. You know when that video was on 20 times? All in the month of April. The video calling for violence and using explosive belts was on Palestinian television in the month of April, just before he announced the cancellation of elections. So Abbas knew he needed violence to distract people, and he succeeded. There was violence all around Jerusalem. There was violence starting all around the country of Israel. So what did Hamas do? Hamas realized that they couldn't let Abbas be alone in this conflict. They didn't want Abbas to go up in the polls because of the violence. Hamas attacked Israel only because Abbas had already started the war, and that's critical. And the tragedy here is that Abbas, the PA, and Hamas were targeting Israelis, killing Israelis, but they were actually just fighting with each other for popularity amongst the Palestinians. Abbas had lost legitimacy, so he killed Israelis. Hamas saw him gaining legitimacy, so he fought to kill Israelis. And we've seen this process reappear many, many times where the Palestinians go and target Israelis to distract the resentment of their own people toward the leadership.
Okay, Itamar, we have Alan Howe who's taking questions from the floor, so I would like to invite him to ask you some questions. Alan.
Thank you, Albert. And Itamar, great to catch up again. I always look forward to your presentations, even if I find them completely depressing. There's a couple of questions, and some of them might be a bit simplistic, but I'll ask them nonetheless. The brainwashing of these Palestinian children, is it just ad hoc and based on hatred, or is it organized and planned in some detail?
Okay, so because we see the same messages coming from school books, children's programs on TV, adult programs on TV, WAD magazine, Fatah Children, it is definitely messages coming from the top of the Palestinian Authority. I'll point out that the Palestinian Authority is a terrible human rights abuser of its own people. There was recently the murder of an activist who was he was an activist primarily on the internet, posting things critical of the government's corruption. And he was murdered in a Palestinian police station. The Palestinian Authority doesn't allow things to be publicized that it doesn't want. So when we see in this controlled government, controlled society, when we see that the same messages are coming everywhere, we know this is all directed from the top.
In 1989, Unicef voted on what they call Article 19, and you're probably familiar with it. So that says children, Article 19, 1989, the Unicef Charter says children have the right to protection from violence, abuse, and neglect, and from being hurt or mistreated physically or mentally. Now, clearly, what happens in the Palestinian authorities is child abuse. How would you instigate a complaint against the authority through UNICEF? How does that work?
Well, we know the dates when UNICEF gives its report. And in the last few years, we have been submitting completely detailed reports to UNICEF, detailing all of this child abuse, detailing how they're turning children into literally child soldiers, with videos like you've seen, and many, many more examples of this. UNICEF, as you know, is a political organization under the UN. It's completely interested in promoting its agenda, with the natural and absolute majority that the Arab and Muslim countries have. They're not going to point out the tragedy of the Palestinian Authority children, which their own leaders have brought upon them. And this is the great tragedy of the international community. And the Western countries here have to take a stand. They have to come to UNICEF and say, we want to protect Palestinian children. Forget about Israel. We want to protect Palestinian children. Why aren't you condemning the Palestinian Authority use of children as child soldiers? I mean, you saw the quotes that I showed to you during the Knife Intifada. Children are being told to go out and being honored for going out. They are the vanguard in this conflict. This is a children's magazine. Why are they being told to go out and stab Israelis and be killed while stabbing Israelis? So UNICEF has been a failure. And again, I blame the international community here for not condemning UNICEF.
This might be a difficult question, but what do Arabs living in Israel make of such brainwashing of children in the Palestinian territories?
So this is the great question that we have to deal with, because Israeli Arabs live amongst us, and Israeli Arabs are citizens. And for the most part, Israeli Arabs are completely are Israeli citizens. There was a poll done at the beginning of the year, and a majority of Israeli Arabs said that they were proud to be Israelis. Now, that's a very important statement. They're not just accepting their Israeli citizenship, they're proud to be Israeli. So that's the first thing. And if you go into Israeli hospitals, you'll see you'll see Arab doctors, and you'll see Arab doctors heading hospitals in the north. There are Arab doctors heading, and you'll see nurses treating Israeli Jewish patients and Israeli Arab patients. So Arabs are blended into Israeli society as equal citizens. And like I said, the majority in that one poll earlier this year actually said they are happy to be, they're proud to be Israelis. There are a fringe among Israeli Arabs who unfortunately showed during the May, when the conflict started this year in May, with Hamas and with the PA, they actually joined the conflict and they started attacking Israelis in Israeli cities. Now, there were thousands of them, but that, again, remember, we have far over 1 million Israeli Arabs. So if thousands of them were involved in violence, we're still talking about a fringe. And what we have to do through education and through policing is make sure that fringe remains a fringe, that the Israeli Arabs know that they are equal citizens and that they are doctors and they are lawyers and they're part of the Israeli infrastructure. And that has to be the goal for Israeli Arabs. Accordingly, I think most Israeli Arabs, I'm sure most Israeli Arabs will be horrified by this education that is being shown here.
And Itamar, are they aware of it?
To a large extent, they're probably not aware of it, but I just want to tell you something. There was a Palestinian news agency, that's primarily focused on Jerusalem affairs. This week published a poll, and they asked Palestinians, in Jerusalem alone, they said, in a final settlement, would you want to be under Israeli citizenship or Palestinian Authority citizenship? Again, Palestinian news agency. And over 90% of the Jerusalem Arabs, they want to retain their Israeli citizenship. The only thing I would say, we don't know. This was done by an Arab website, a Palestinian website. We don't know to what extent they used scientific data, scientific procedure in this, but it is a Palestinian source. The only thing I can say is that it confirms other polls that were done in the past. They weren't this high, but polls done in the past found 70% of Jerusalem Arabs, and those were done scientifically. 70% of Jerusalem Arabs want to retain their Israeli citizenship. So here you have another situation where it's not just Israeli Arabs who already are citizenship. You're talking about the Palestinians in Jerusalem who are only under Israeli rule since 1967. They either have citizenship or they have permanent residency. They want to remain part of Israel. And I think that's an important statement. As much as there is a lot of, there's this poison and the hatred of the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian population understands that Israel is a good democracy. It's better to live under Israel. Israeli Arabs certainly understand it, but even the Jerusalem Arabs definitely understand it, with this overwhelming majority wanting to remain under Israel, not under the PA.
Alan, you have one more question, please.
Okay, one more. Itamar, do Palestinian Authority children, first of all, how many are bilingual, and how many maybe speak English as well? But do they have unfettered access to the internet in a way, for instance, the Chinese youth do not?
So first I'll answer the second question. I think the last polls have found over 90% or more of Palestinians have access to the internet. The Palestinian Authority is not censoring it, so that they do have access to the internet. The first question is I would say the caveat almost is the problem here, and that is that the majority of Palestinians speak, even if they've taught English and they are taught English in schools, they don't reach a level of proficiency that they're going to be going on the internet and checking out internet sites. I have met Palestinians who have high proficiency in English who did that. In fact, the Palestinian who I mentioned before, who I told you has met with me with foreign parliamentarians, he is an expert in English. He's from a refugee camp. He hated Israelis. Eventually, through his English, he started studying independently. And it was through his ability in English that he eventually realized that his entire world was a lie. An entire worldview was a lie. And that's when he started embracing Israelis and working for peace with Israelis. So the answer is they have access. They don't speak English well enough to really do the investigations of their own. And hopefully at some point they will have enough English to be able to do that. And maybe at that point we'll have a slight change in the ideology of these children.
Thanks,
Itamar, let me indulge with the last question, and that is, knowing the work that you're doing in Israel, the authorities are very well aware about the narrative in the Palestinian Authority and Gaza. Is there like a pushback, like a radio transmitting in Arabic towards those territories, or a TV made specially for them that they could tune to, or messages sent through the internet and so on? Is there a pushback from the Israelis to redress this? I mean, you saw it during the Cold War, you saw this in many other parts of the world. Is there anything like that happening?
So it's interesting that satellite TV has ended up being a disservice for this. And I'll explain to you why. Before satellite TV, when people had their home antennas and their roof antennas, the majority of Palestinians were actually watching, we're watching Israeli television news. More we're watching Israeli television news than we're watching Palestinian news. In addition, Israel has numerous Arabic language programs, which including sitcoms, which show Arab and Israelis living together and being friends together. So Israeli TV has this showing Israelis and Arabs living together comfortably in Israel. This was going on. With the advent of satellite television, Palestinians all have either Nilesat or Arabsat, both of which they have many, they have close to 100 different stations, but none of them are going to be Israeli stations because Israel can't get its messages onto those. So therefore they're cut off. On the other hand, there is the internet, and there are WhatsApp groups, and there's the Israeli Arabic language spokesman who is sending out Arabic language messages all the time. He's tweeting in Arabic. He has many followers, I would say, around the entire Arabic speaking world. So some messages are going through that. And like I said to you, we're working with Palestinians. I know other people who are working with Palestinians. We've had in addition to the person I mentioned to you, we've had a translator working with Palestinian Media Watch from an Arab city, and he's translating because he wants peace with Israel. And he realizes that this messages have to get out. And he wants to live in a democracy, not under the Palestinian Authority. So the answer is the messages are accessible. They're not getting out enough. And eventually it is through giving truth to the Palestinian people about Israel's right to exist, about Israel being a good neighbor, just wanting to live together with them in peace. That's going to be the key to a change. But I don't see it happening in the near future. Again, not without major foreign intervention and pressure on the PA.
Okay, well, Itamar, I cannot say it was a pleasure to see you. It is never a pleasure to see you. I always feel very depressed after talking to you, but it was still an important meeting, and we'll continue to be in touch. I want to tell everyone that the next session is starting at 7:30. My guest will be Jonathan Barnett. We're going to talk about the unintended consequences of the electric car, and that will be a much less depressing subject, hopefully. Itamar, thank you again. If you are watching on YouTube, please press the subscribe button. I will talk to you soon. Thank you, Itamar.
Thank you very much, Albert.